another interactive creative class. Today we are going to look at photography and cameras. What is photography? Photography is the introduction of light into a dark box from one extreme to another. And today we are going to focus on types of cameras. We are going to also look at the different lens for cameras or for photography. We are going to look at the values of photography. We are going to look at the functions of photography. And we are going to look again at the uses of photography in our day-to-day life. Join me in class as we explore the world of photography.
Just as a painter needs to know everything about his paints and brushes, a photographer must know everything about his camera. So let's now explore the camera and all its parts. Let's begin with the camera lens. The type of lens will depend on the type of camera. For smaller cameras, these are usually fixed lenses, where they are built directly into the camera body itself. For larger SLR or DSLR cameras, you'll find detachable lenses, which give you the ability to use different types. With detachable lenses, you'll find two important settings. One selects either automatic focus or manual focus, and the other is for image stabilization. You'll also find between 1 to 3 rotating control rings, which allow you to manually adjust the focus, zoom, and aperture. Next, let's take a look at the camera body, which is completely sealed, not allowing any unwanted light to reach the camera's sensor. It also contains all the various parts required to take a photograph. It holds the control buttons, which give you quick access to the various camera control functions. For example, the one with the letters WB allows you to adjust the white balance. On and off allow you to switch the camera, on and off. The buttons with arrows on them give you access to the gallery of captured images on your device. The magnifying glass leads to the zoom tool. A trash can symbol allows you to delete. The lightning bolt is where you'll find the camera's flash settings. In the same way, the ISO and menu buttons will bring you to their controls. If you see a plus and minus symbol, that's what you'll use to adjust the exposure. The letters AF stand for automatic focus, and MF for manual focus. An illuminated red dot indicates that you are recording video. Finally, most cameras have a control knob or wheel with which you can use to quickly scroll through different operating modes or settings. These are default settings used for specific situations. For example, if you are photographing a soccer game, you can use the sport mode. If you're traveling, you might use the landscape mode. And for night shots, there is night mode. Keep in mind that the number and location of these buttons will depend on the camera being used. Each type and model of a camera might feature them in slightly different ways or positions. So it's important for you to fully explore your camera and read any instruction manuals that come with it. Two more essential parts of any camera are the viewfinder and screen. These will allow you to compose, frame, and visualize your shot before taking it. Some cameras will also use these to display information relating to aperture, ISO, and shutter speed settings. Now let's go inside the camera and take a look at some of the most important parts. The shutter regulates the length of time that the camera sensor is exposed to light. Using the shutter, the camera controls overall exposure time. When you press the button to take your picture, a mechanism opens and closes inside your camera based on your exposure settings. This is how light is allowed to enter the camera. Another important component found in the lens is the diaphragm. Small overlapping blades form the size of the hole through which the light will enter the lens. It regulates the amount of light that the camera's sensor will ultimately receive. So remember, the shutter is what regulates the length of time that the light enters the camera, and the diaphragm regulates the amount of light that reaches the sensor. Now, if you're wondering what sensor are they talking about, we invite you to check out our previous video where we discuss in more detail the camera's sensor.
What is aperture? Perhaps the most influential parameter of photography, aperture plays an important role in composition and setting up a shot. Let's take a closer look. Simply put, aperture is the hole in the lens through which light travels into the camera body and onto the camera sensor. To understand, let's look at the human eye. All cameras are designed like human eyes. The cornea of our eye is similar to the front element of the lens, gathering light and bending it inward toward the iris. The iris can expand or shrink, controlling the size of the pupil, which passes light into the inner eye. The pupil is what we refer to as the aperture in photography. The amount of light that falls onto the retina is determined by the size of the pupil. The larger the pupil, the more light falls onto the retina. The larger the aperture of the lens, the more light enters the camera. The iris of the lens controls the size of the aperture and is called the diaphragm. The diaphragm's function is to block all light with the exception of the light that goes through the aperture. In photography, aperture is expressed in f numbers, also known as f-stops. F-stops are a way of describing how open or closed the aperture is. The smaller the f-stop means a larger aperture, while a larger f-stop means a smaller aperture. This can be tricky to remember since large f-stops mean small aperture sizes. So an f-stop of f1.4 is larger than f2.8 and much larger than f8 or f11. Aside from controlling the amount of light passing through the lens and into the camera, the aperture has a direct impact on the depth of field, the area of the image that appears sharp. A large f number such as f16 will bring all foreground and background objects into focus, while a small f number such as f1.4 will isolate either the foreground or background objects and make everything else blurry. Every lens has a limit on how large or small the aperture can get. If you take a look at the specifications of your lens, it should indicate the maximum apertures, lowest f numbers, and minimum apertures, highest f numbers. The maximum aperture of the lens is much more important than the minimum aperture because it shows the speed of the lens. Lenses with apertures of f1.4 or f2.8 are considered fast lenses because they can pass more light into the camera than, for example, a lens with a maximum aperture of f4 or f5.6. That's the reason night photography usually requires fast lenses. The minimum aperture of a lens is usually not important and should rarely be used as diffraction will cause the image to lose clarity. It is also worth noting the two types of lenses, primes and zooms. Prime lenses have a fixed focal length, meaning they cannot zoom without physically moving closer or further away from the subject. Zoom lenses give you the flexibility for you to zoom in or out of an object while remaining stationary. While prime lenses will have a fixed maximum aperture, the maximum aperture of a zoom lens will often get smaller as the focal length increases. These lenses are called variable aperture lenses. This is important because for a zoom lens with a focal length of 70 to 200 millimeters, the aperture may increase from f3.5 to f5.6, decreasing the amount of light entering the camera. Because aperture controls the amount of light entering the camera, it also affects other parameters such as ISO and shutter speed. A larger aperture or smaller f number will let more light into the camera, allowing you to use a faster shutter speed or lower ISO value. This is beneficial to eliminate motion blur and reduce the amount of noise that your camera will produce if its ISO gets bumped up. Faster shutter speeds can be essential in scenes with lots of motion, like sports and wildlife photography. So a fast lens can help increase your shutter speed or decrease your ISO value if your shutter speed is set to a specific value. Fast lenses are also imperative for any kind of nighttime photography. Whether you're taking pictures of the Milky Way or doing a moonlit photo shoot, large apertures will let as much light in as possible. Small apertures can be useful as well. Shooting landscape scenes requires everything in crisp focus, so smaller apertures will sharpen any out-of-focus areas that may come about. To enable manual adjustment of aperture values, set your camera to either aperture priority or manual mode. Aperture priority will let you change aperture values manually, while leaving shutter speed and ISO up to the camera's internal metering system. Manual mode lets you control every aspect of the camera, allowing you to change ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. I personally leave my camera in aperture priority mode 99% of the time for most types of photography. With all this information, you should be able to start using your lenses and cameras to the best of their ability. Aperture is probably the most stylistic setting you can change on your camera, allowing for unique effects that can take your images to the next level.